My title this morning is the same as my title this afternoon. His meaning is love. God always purposes the very best for you and me because he loves us. So whatever happens in your life, remember that his meaning is love. You can imagine that my mail is filled with people's problems. People write to me who have listened on the radio or perhaps read one of my books. And when I read these letters, Lars and I agree that we feel as if we have never had a problem in our lives. We don't know what trouble is compared to some of the stories that we receive. And people expect me to solve their problems, to answer their unanswerable questions. And if I say it once, I try to say it over and over again in books, in talks, on the radio. Jesus Christ is the answer. Take your problems to the cross. I don't know anything else to tell you. You're going to hear this 20,000 times. If you read anything I write or listen to anything I say it in every way that I can think of. And if I were to say, now, what should I talk to those women in Collingswood about? I don't know what their problems are. I don't know a soul in this room except Ruth and Arlita. I don't know anything about Ruth's problems. I know a few of Arlita's. She just has a few little things like cancer and things like that she's dealt with recently. But if I knew all your problems, what would I do? Would I have anything different to say? No, I really wouldn't. Jesus is the answer. And what I said this morning, I will say again. It is in your situation, within the context where God has put you, that he wants to make himself real to you, that he wants to teach you to know him in a way that you could not know him without that particular thing that may be emptying your hands and breaking your heart. It is that very thing that is designed by a loving creator, the one who made the stars, designed precisely to give you the opportunity to become a saint. That's where it is, right there where you are. So what you and I need to do is to remember the meaning of the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, thy kingdom come, not mine, thy will be done, mine be undone if necessary. And now let's think about that next phrase, give us this day our daily bread. As I said this morning, we won't have time to get through the whole of the Lord's Prayer, but these are crucial things. And we need to disengage ourselves from all that we feel, suppose, imagine, and experience if we are to learn of him and to walk with him and to cooperate in the bringing in of his kingdom and in the accomplishment of his will. I'll say that again. We need to disengage ourselves from all that we feel, suppose, and imagine if we are to learn of him, walk with him, and cooperate in the bringing in of his kingdom and the accomplishment of his will. And I'm sure that I'm speaking to many who do most earnestly and honestly in the depths of your heart desire to cooperate with him in the bringing in of that kingdom and to participate with the doing of his will. What a privilege it is. What a tremendous privilege that he deigns to call you and me, who are so fallible, so sinful, so weak, so foolish, so faithless, and how I'm comforted by the fact that Jesus even had to say to his disciples, "O fools, and slow of heart to believe." They were slow, I'm slower. And we are to confine ourselves to the present moment or to the present day without taking thought for yesterday or tomorrow. Now remember, yesterday is not your property anymore. It's gone, it's over, it belongs to God. Yes, tomorrow is none of your business, It is God's property, and God is already there. Have you thought about that? Whatever it is that you're scared to death about that might happen tomorrow, remember, God's already there. He's got the whole thing completely in his hands. And he is not the least bit worried. Our Father, who is in heaven, is not the least bit worried. And whatever measure of grace is going to be demanded by tomorrow's demands, it will be there. I spoke with a young woman this morning who came up and introduced herself to me. She'd written me a letter to tell me about her young husband's recent death. And she testified just in those maybe 90 seconds that we had together. The grace is here. The grace came when the event that I knew I couldn't endure actually took place. I remember when Jim Elliot was going into dangerous territory, we knew the possibilities. These people that he was going to try to reach with the gospel were Stone Age, they were naked, and they killed strangers. We really didn't know anything else about them, except that they needed Christ. And so my imagination went wild. I have a very vivid imagination, and I can dream wildly and vividly, and I can think up all sorts of horrible possibilities about the future. And so as we planned and talked and prayed over what was called Operation Auca, I thought, what will I do if he doesn't come back? I'll just die. I can't stand it. I won't be able to survive. He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. But why should he give me grace for my imaginations? He doesn't need to do that. And when somebody says to me, oh, I could never go through what you went through, all I can say is, you didn't have to. But if you do, if the day comes when God does something similar, exactly the same supply will be there from exactly the same source. And it is to him that I point you today. Not to me, but to Jesus Christ and his cross. So let us learn and discipline ourselves, take ourselves sometimes just by the scruff of the neck, and confine ourselves to the present moment. It is here and now. God does not want your mind back home. There will be 1,000 things to do when you leave here and get home. And all you young mothers who have had to make all sorts of elaborate arrangements in order to get away, you know what you have to do when you get home, but that's not what you're supposed to be thinking about now. That's God's business, and God will be there when you get there. And he's here right now. Jesus says, take no thought for tomorrow. Tomorrow will take thought for the things of itself. But that doesn't mean not to make up the grocery list. That doesn't mean you're not supposed to plan if you're having company for dinner tomorrow night, or get to the grocery store in order to buy the basics for your own family. Planning for tomorrow is today's business, but not worrying about tomorrow. That is not today's business or any day's business. Do not be anxious. Do not worry about anything whatever, Jesus says. So if you want to know how to simplify your life, and I think most of us do recognize that we need to simplify our lives, to cut back, to get rid of stuff, to sort through, put things in 3 piles, put away, give away, throw away. And you should be doing that constantly so that you don't have to do a major upheaval every 10 years or something. Somebody has said, one move is worth a good fire. But simplifying our lives is a spiritual responsibility. Hudson Taylor used to go through everything he owned every year. And whatever he had not used in the past year, he felt morally obliged to give to God, or in other words, to give away to somebody who needed it, because he said, if I haven't used it for a year, I don't need it. Somebody else needs it. Give it to them. And that's a wonderful way to keep thrown away, as my sister-in-law says. We were talking about people who are always having to go through these huge upheavals and get rid of tons of things. And she said, we stay thrown away. And I think that's a good way to be. Recently, I saw an article in the Boston Globe on simplifying one's life. And the author was taking the very interesting view that most people have too much. And she was asking the question, how much is enough? And she said, what does one give to a person who has everything? And she came up with a brilliant suggestion. She said, how about nothing? Now remember that when you make up your Christmas list. You got a lot of people on the list that have everything. How about nothing? But I need to reduce my life to the pure and simple will of God. When I get home from this trip, which takes us tonight to Lancaster and on Wednesday to Oregon, we will find a big pile of work when we get home. And that used to bother me terribly. I just hated to be away as long as a week. And I would just want to sink in despair and not even look at the pile that would be on the kitchen counter by the time we get home. We have a student who picks up our mail and puts it in the kitchen counter. But some years ago, finally, after unnecessary struggling and worrying, it got through to me that the spiritual life is really very simple, because I only have one thing to do, the will of God. I only have one thing to do, the will of God. Paul said, this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, looking forth to those things which are before, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Mary chose the one thing needful. The psalmist said, one thing have I desired of thee, that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord. What is the object of your life? It is the one thing. Now, how do I know what that is? How do I learn to receive the one thing that God gives me to do? I pray, give me today my daily bread. I don't suppose there are very many people in this room who are actually worried about whether there will be anything to eat when you get home tonight. Here in America, we hardly know anything at all about sacrifice and suffering, let alone real hunger. But there are many other things that God puts on our daily platter besides literal physical bread. And even that we get to taking for granted so often because we have such a superabundance. But I take everything that comes along every day as being part of what God is handing me on a platter. You ask for my will, here it is. Here is your daily bread. This is the measure that is exactly proportioned to what you need today. This is what I want you to do. This is where I want you to glorify me. These are the present moments. These are the moments that I'm going to thread into hours. So when I pray, give us this day our daily bread, I realize that I am covenanting with God to accept whatever happens to be on that plate. There's an ancient Orthodox prayer that says, in unforeseen events, let me not forget that all are sent by you. Teach me to treat all that comes to me with peace of soul and with firm conviction that your will governs all. My husband and I had the not very enviable experience of finding ourselves on the wrong airplane one time. By the grace of God, the plane had not actually left the terminal, but the jetway had already been retrieved when we realized that we were on a plane going to Spokane instead of on a plane going to Boston. Well, we shot out of those chairs and, of course, let the cabin attendant know that they had two stupid, inexperienced travelers that had no better sense than to get on the wrong plane. When we got off the plane, we found out, it's too long a story to tell you all here, but we thought we were booked on another flight. Of course, our luggage had already gone ahead, and the special meal that Lars had ordered had already gone on the other plane, and one thing and another. And so we thought we were booked in another plane. We found out that that plane had left, and we found out there were no more flights to Boston that night. So there I was with a purse, nothing else. And we had to find a place to stay that night. But the first thing that came to my mind when I found out that there were no more flights out of Chicago was the words of this prayer. In unforeseen events, let me not forget that all are sent by you. Teach me to treat all that comes to me with peace of soul and with firm conviction that your will governs all. Now, how do you think Jesus himself learned these lessons? Jesus had to learn things, you know. He was a child. He was a helpless baby. He cried. He wet his pants. He had to be fed by his mother. He was a little normal child. And he grew up with his earthly father, Joseph, and we assume that he had to learn carpentry in a very humble place, very out of the way, nowheresville village, where day by day he had to learn faithfulness, humility, thoroughness in his work, gladness in serving. And I think when he said to his disciples, I do always the things which I've seen my Father do, perhaps he had learned that great spiritual lesson as he worked under his foster father in the carpenter shop. And as Joseph would show him how to use a tool, I can just picture the little boy looking up and saying, is this right, Daddy? Is this right? Is this the way you do it? Now, where do you expect God to teach you and me? If not in some humble, ordinary, very likely manual work. Those are the places to learn faithfulness. He that is faithful in that which is least, I will make him ruler over many things. It is in the small things. Arlita and I both went to a school in Florida where the headmistress was a very redoubtable woman, taller than I am, weighed about 80 pounds more, and she had a no-nonsense, sledgehammer kind of a personality. And one of the things that she said to us over and over again was, don't go around with the Bible under your arm if you didn't sweep under the bed. We had room inspection. We had no vacuum cleaners. We had to sweep our rooms every day, rugs and everything, with a broom. And inspection took place during breakfast, and people that flunked were announced. Their names were announced. But Mrs. DuBose did not want pious talk coming out of a room that was messy. Don't go around with the Bible under your arm if you can't sweep under the bed. Give us this day our daily bread. If our daily bread involves laundry and cleaning and washing and ironing and wiping little messy noses and doing diapers, that's the very best place in the world to learn to be a saint. And if it's a boring job by a desk, if it's the job of a student, whatever, that's the very place in which we are to learn the great lesson that each moment brings its appointed task faithfully to be accomplished. You remember that when the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they were missing some of the food that they'd had back in Egypt, like leeks and onions and garlic and watermelons and fish. And all they had was manna. They wanted the not given. They complained about the given. But the manna was all they needed, and it was exactly as much as they needed, and they were forbidden to collect manna for the next day, except on the day preceding the Sabbath. They were not allowed to collect manna on the Sabbath, so they were allowed to collect extra on only that one day a week. And if they collected more than they needed the rest of the time, it bred worms. That should be a lesson in simplifying our lives too, shouldn't it? If we have more than we need, it breeds worms in our consciences, in our hearts. A man's or a woman's life consisteth not in the abundance of things that she possesseth. And that goes for the clothes in your closet. You get a new dress, you give away an old one. Okay? Well, I know I've quit preaching and gone to meddling. I'm told that there is an inscription in an old English parsonage down by the sea. It says, do the next thing. That has been a rule of my life. If I don't know what to do, the liberating truth is just do the next thing. And this was therapy for me when I found out that my husband had died and we were living in the jungle. I was alone on a mission station, except for my 10-month-old baby. I had twice as much work to do now. I was going to try to do the work that Jim and I had been doing together. And I could have been completely overwhelmed and just thought, I can't do it. I might as well go back to the States, forget it. How am I ever going to do this? But that really would not have been a good way to go at things. I believed that God had called me to be a missionary long before I ever married Jim Elliott. It had nothing to do with his being a missionary. So nothing had changed as far as my call was concerned. So I stayed there and I did the next thing. I remembered that. My mother had taught me that years before, and Mrs. DeBose had said that. That was another one of her Vespers messages. Do the next thing. So I tried to teach my daughter that. When my daughter was having baby number 5, she is now expecting baby number 8. This was way back when she was having number 5. I was staying in her home taking care of the other 4 children. And bless her dear heart, she called me that evening from the hospital and she had said, well, Mama, how are you doing? And I said, I never had 4 children. I only had 1, and there's a lot to do. And I said, understatement of the century. I said, your children are very obedient. I have no complaints about that. They are respectful. They do what I tell them to do. But Val, I don't see how you do all this every day. I'm just here for temporarily. And what in the world are you going to do when you come home with a nursing baby? It takes about 6 hours a day to nurse a baby, doesn't it? Where are you going to find those 6 hours? Well, she just laughed. She said, Mama, don't think about all that you're supposed to do. Just do the next thing. And guess what? I managed to make it through those 2 or 3 days until she came home. But it is a liberating rule in my life. We get home next Monday, I look at the pile in the kitchen and I do the next thing. And the next thing might just be to peel an onion in order to make Lars's soup. But God reveals himself to the humble in small things. It's in small things mostly. Most of our lives are made up of small things. He does not give us heroics. He's not asking you and me to do some great thing. If he has something great for you to do sometime, you will have to be prepared over a long, quiet, hidden course that nobody's going to notice. And let's remember that women's work is the kind of work that nobody notices as long as you do it. And the whole world will notice it if you don't. Give us this day our daily bread is a way of saying, yes, Lord, yes, I'll take it. Whatever is on the platter, I'll take it. Now remind yourself of this. Before you go to bed tonight, something is going to cross your will. It's on the platter. God knows it's there, and he did not bring you here for nothing. Remember that. I don't know what he wants to say to you. I don't know the point, the sore point in your life, but he knows, and he has put exactly the right things on that platter. And they will be revealed to you one by one, moment by moment, as you move through the day in company with Christ. You know, there's actually a verse that says that. He died for us so that we, awake or asleep, might live in company with him. That's in 1 Thessalonians 5:10. I think it's the New International Version. I love that expression, that we might live in company with him. Okay, for you note takers, number 1 was give us this day our daily bread. Number 2 is why pray if you won't receive. We're talking about the Lord's Prayer. Why would I pray a prayer like give us this day our daily bread if I am not already disposed to receive whatever God puts on that platter? It doesn't make any sense to say, I want your will, Lord. I want to cooperate in the coming of your kingdom. I will take what's on the platter, and then not receive it when it comes. I spoke about one gift that many of you perhaps have never thought of before as a gift: old age. Now, the gray hair, I think, is beautiful, and it is the crown of old age, and there are a whole lot of things about old age that are not really very painful at all. But then there are those weaknesses we begin to realize, and how many times have you heard old people say this, I'm not as fast as I used to be. I can't do as much as I used to do. And gradually we find ourselves divested of our powers. And I love what George MacDonald says about that. God is undressing us for our last sweet bed. Just as a mother takes off the tiny little garments one by one, getting the baby ready for bed. And God, in his mercy, has to divest us, deprive us one after another of our powers in order that we may be prepared to go to bed, to let go of everything that this life has held. So think of that as one of the things on your platter and everything that it entails. It's a temptation to be afraid, isn't it, of the loneliness that might be ahead, of the helplessness, of the possible dependency on somebody else, which is probably the most horrifying prospect for any of us who have been energetic and independent all our lives. We've been the givers. We dread the thought of being a taker and having to have our children be the givers. Your disappointment. Will you receive that disappointment as from a loving Father? His meaning is love. He has to say no. For the same reason that you mothers who love your children, when the child asks, may I have another popsicle? If you have any sense, you're going to say no. He doesn't need 2 popsicles. He doesn't need 1 popsicle right before supper. And the child looks at you and says, you never let me have anything. And you try to tell the child that the reason you say no is because you love him. And he doesn't believe you any more than you believe God. When God says no to your prayers, it's because he loves you. He knows a stone when he sees it. You don't. And the scripture says that he will not give us stones if we ask for bread. But how in the world is he going to give us bread if we ask for stones? A lot of the things we pray about are scorpions. It says he won't give you a scorpion if you ask for a fish. But suppose you're asking for a scorpion. Marriage, which looks like such a wonderful thing, such a thing that no woman ought to have to live without. That's the way some women feel. That's not the way all of them feel. I've had some women who were very angry with me because I said that. I said, I want you to know there's a whole lot of us that don't need any men in our lives. I said, but if that happens to be the way you feel and God doesn't give you that, then just remember that marriage may be, in God's eyes for you, a scorpion. Something that he knows is not good for you, and so he says no because he loves you. So when you pray, you must be willing to receive. How many times I've heard women say, my husband is not meeting my needs. What do I do when my husband doesn't meet my needs? I'm supposed to be meeting his needs all the time, and I'm boring myself out, and I'm meeting my children's needs, and I work my fingers to the bone in the church, and what kind of thanks do I get? But my husband's not meeting my needs. And a mother came to me and she said, what shall I tell my daughter who is planning to divorce her husband because he doesn't meet all her needs? And I heaved a great sigh and I said to that poor mother, whatever gave your poor daughter the outrageous idea that her husband could meet all her needs? If I had all 3 of my husbands simultaneously, they could not possibly meet all my needs. St. Augustine said, O God, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. There is no other place where our hearts are going to find rest. And so every deprivation, every loss, every disappointment is God's putting his finger on your life and saying, I'm here. I am your all-sufficiency. I am your Lord. I am your Savior. I am your shepherd. I am your friend. There's one of C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories in which Lucy is trying to get to a spring of water. And Aslan, the great lion, is in the way. And very politely and very timidly, she asks this fierce lion, who she knows is not tame, if he would kindly just move so that she can get to the spring. And Aslan says no. And she says, well, then I must find another spring. And he looks at her with great tenderness and he says, there is no other spring. We're always looking for other springs, aren't we? How many of you know that beautiful poem by Francis Thompson, The Hound of Heaven? A few of you. Those of you that don't, you should race to your library and find it. It's a wonderful description of a man who sought God in everything but God himself. He tried to find peace in nature. He tried to find love in the faces of little children. He tried busyness. He tried fleeing from God. And the metaphor of the poem is that God was like a hound with deliberate speed, majestic instancy, measured pace, following. And the hound says, all things fly thee, who fliest me. You won't find peace. You won't find rest, fulfillment, contentment anywhere else. And then at the end of the poem, after the man has tried in desperation to get away from God and has been living in such darkness and such gloom, he says, is my gloom, after all, shade of his hand outstretched, caressing me? In unforeseen events, let me not forget that all are sent by you. And lastly, the third thing, God is each moment offering himself to you and me. He never ceases to offer himself to us. It's the pouring out of himself for us as he poured out his life on the cross. He never stops pouring himself out to us, giving himself to us in the stars, for example. Just that one little tidbit that I told you about Antares, that should carry you for days if you just think about it. Look at one flower. He's giving himself to me. The face of a baby. Just the last few days, I've been with my daughter and her youngest, who's 16 months old. To look at the face of that little boy, it's just a gift from God. And I constantly referred this face to the God who made him and realized that God is giving me this child. Let your heart be filled not by the world or by your fantasies, but by Jesus Christ himself. Let him be your all in all. His coming is not with observation. Thou shalt know him when he comes, not by any din of drums, nor the vantage of his airs, nor by anything he wears, but his coming known shall be by the holy harmony that his coming makes in thee. He comes quietly. He comes in the small things, not through reason, argument, reflection, and very rarely for most of us in any special spiritual experience. You're not looking at a woman who's had any very dramatic spiritual experiences. I have heard no voices. I've seen no visions. I've had no overwhelming sense of the presence of God in any very special way. He comes in the ordinary things of every day.